Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 12th chapter in the book of Exodus. We made it all the way up until the 30th verse, and therein we read of the protocols to be observed, the processes within the process of celebrating Passover, which commemorates a very specific event which launched the Exodus. And we read of the Exodus in the first section we'll be covering, which comes after that. Then we're going to read of rules and regulations to be governing foreigners who partook in the covenant community and in the Passover. But in the verse we'll be covering, we find Moses summoned to Pharaoh's palace once more. And what's interesting is after the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, the 28th and 29th verse, in the 10th chapter, Pharaoh expels him from his presence on the threat of death, and Moses says, fine, and to read the passage itself, and Pharaoh said to him, get away from me, watch yourself, and see my face no more, for in the day you see my face you shall die. And Moses said, you have spoken rightly, never again do I see your face. But so dramatic was the 10th and final plague that Pharaoh summons him to his court and finally accommodates his request at long last to let his people go. But in the 11th chapter we read, and Yahweh said to Moses, I am bringing yet one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and that is going to let you go from here. When he lets you go, he shall drive you out from here altogether. So he's finally going to accomplish his promise and his purpose of compelling Pharaoh, the absolute monarch in whose iron grips the Hebrew slaves' fate rested. He's going to compel him to let him go because this plague is going to be so devastating. It's going to be the death of the firstborn of the plague. And we read of what we can expect and of what we read in the in the passage we'll be covering. Verse 4. And Moses said, thus said Yahweh, about midnight I am going into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of cattle. So somewhere towards the tail end of what we already covered in this chapter, we read that the prisoner in the gate and the Pharaoh on high, there's a top-to-bottom democracy about this death that is visited. Every firstborn of every human and cattle is going to die in this plague. The angel of death is going to visit them. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or ever be again. So the extent and the scope of this cry and lament and wail is going to be something unprecedented and unduplicated. But against any of the children of Israel, no dog shall move its tongue against man or against beast, so that you know that Yahweh makes distinction between Egypt and Israel. So in several of the prior plagues, the gnats, they consume the Egyptian farms, but the Hebrew ones in the land of Goshen were left unmolested. But this time the Israelites had to do something in order to mark themselves safe. They had to paint their doorpost with lamb's blood, and there are very specific requirements. We're just going to review what we've already covered in the 12th chapter. 2nd verse, this month is the beginning of the months for you. It is the first month of the year for you. So this was a new lease on life. This was a historically significant that this event, this calendar, was to signal the mark of their new year. It was to determine the date. They're to have lambs. First, we read of lambs that are there to roast. And verse 5, let the lamb be a perfect one, a year-old male. Take it from the sheep or from the goats. The perfection just means spotless, without blemish, without physical blemish. And this is to be a typological allusion to the sinless Savior who is our atonement, capital letter A, versus the atonements, lowercase a, plural, were lambs. Don't eat it raw. We read verse 9, and then this is how you eat it. We read in verse 11. But then verse 12, and I shall pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and shall smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and of all the mighty ones of Egypt I shall execute judgment. I am Yahweh. So he's going to do what he already promised. He's going to walk through the land, and his angel of death will smite all the firstborn, both man and beast, beast and cattle, Pharaoh, all the way to the dungeon, and the female servants' firstborn. These plagues do correspond with the polytheistic pantheon of Egyptian deities, but that's a subject. That's something for another subject. But they all do correspond, such as the plague of darkness was an indictment against Ra, the Egyptian god of the sun, because he controlled the sun, and where was the sun? So he demonstrated Ra's impotence against him. And the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and let the plague not come on you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. So this is where the holiday gets its name, Passover, because the angel of death passed over the doorposts, which were marked by the blood of the lamb. And this is how the Israelites had to do something to mark themselves. So in the previous plagues, they didn't have to do anything, no preparations, no a special warning, except what was given to Moses. But here, this is community, countrywide knowledge, and they're about to become a country on the move to settle in their home country. And this day shall be to you a remembrance, and you shall observe it as a festival to Yahweh throughout your generations. Observe it as a festival, an everlasting law. So this is something that not only marks the beginning of their calendar, but also to be observed in perpetuity annually. Every year, Jews have celebrated this historical event, and they have done it as prescribed. And then there's everything is chronologically precise according to the dating, both the day of the calendar year, the 10th day of this month, in the 3rd verse, and then 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. The exigencies of the emergency situation prevented the escaped Exodus generation from cooking bread, just having yeast in the bread. And the first on the 14th day of the month in the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month in the evening. So therein we learn it's a 7-day holiday. So for 7 days they are to commemorate their ancestors' experience by eating unleavened bread, because their ancestors, they had an emergency situation. Do not eat that which is leavened. In all your dwellings you are to eat unleavened bread. So no one anywhere at any level in any home in this community is to eat bread that is unleavened. And you shall guard this word as a law for you and your sons forever. So it's meant to be celebrated not only by the present generation, but to be passed on and commemorated by the future generations, the progeny, the nation of Israel to come, and that forever. And it shall be when your children say to you, what does this service mean to you? Then you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our households. And the people bowed their heads and did obeisance. So Moses is telling them just asking and answering a question that they will anticipate when their children ask, what does this all mean? Why are we doing it? And he's telling them that it is linked to the memory of the event when the angel of death passed over the houses of Israel, which were marked safe by the blood of the Lamb, which as Christians, the blood of the Lamb is what procures our salvation. And the children of Israel went away and did so, as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. So they had the instructions, they had the requirements, they had the demands, they filled them to the T. There was instant and community-wide obedience. And it came to be at about midnight that Yahweh smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and of all the firstborn in the livestock. Remember, in the 11th chapter, it is the female servant, but now it's the lowest of the low, from the palace to the prison. Everyone in Egyptian society who is not marked, everyone within their empire, their territory that is not marked by the blood of the Lamb, will have their firstborn killed. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, and there was not a house where there was not a dead one. So just as foretold, just as promised, there's going to be a great cry, the volume of which is going to be shatter the country, because no household is going to be untouched, unmolested by this plague. And this brings us to the 31st verse. This marks the beginning of the lesson itself. And now Pharaoh was finally personally affected by one of these plagues, and he was a hard-hearted man. No amount of evidence working against him or for Israel could persuade him to let Moses' people go, but he was purposely hard-hearted. And he had was so he wanted Moses, if Moses showed his face again to him, he would kill him, but now he summons him. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Arise, go out from the midst of my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve Yahweh as you have said." So he's summoning them to tell them, I've had enough, get out of here. I know this God, this Yahweh is working on your behalf, and he just killed my own son, and there's a cry throughout my kingdom from the north to the south, to the east to the west. No house is left unscathed or untouched. So I want you to pack your things and go. Your request is granted. You can go and serve Yahweh as you have said. Much of the details in their petition we read of in the earlier chapters. They asked to go to the desert to worship Yahweh. And Pharaoh is, of course, skeptical because he is a hard-hearted man. "Take both your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and go. Then you shall bless me too." So Pharaoh has the sense that he is being confronted by a superior supernatural force in the form of Yahweh, who is working for his people through Moses and through Aaron. But he's asking for his blessing. He could not confess that he never came to the outright confession that Yahweh was God and not he, because Pharaoh were considered living deities by their own people and by themselves. But he's asking for the blessing of this tangibly superior supernatural entity, and he's telling them not only so you can take what belongs to you, your flocks, your herds, and just get up, get out, go. And the Egyptians urged the people to hasten to send them away out of the land, for they said, "We are all dying." So the average Egyptian was not as hard-hearted as Pharaoh. They had been visited by all these plagues, and they finally and fully received the message that it is on behalf of these people that these calamitous plagues are afflicting and visiting our nation, and we are dying. We don't want to die. What is it worth to us if we maintain the slave labor force, if all our children are dying? So they know what's up. They want them to get out, and they're begging the Israelites and perhaps begging Pharaoh or the government officials to let them go. "And the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their garments on their shoulders." Remember the haste of the emergency situation. Once they get the green light, they are to go. They are not to waste any time. They are to be geared and prepared to move, and as such, they wouldn't have had time to add leaven to bread, to give it that fluff, to give it that puff, to give it that doughy sensation, the taste. But matzah really isn't that bad. I've had some of it myself. It's actually quite good with horseradish. And the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked for the Egyptian objects of silver and objects of gold and garments. So they're not going to leave, they're going to loot, they're going to voluntarily ask, and the Egyptians are going to be glad to surrender what wealth they have, because they just lost their firstborn son. And when you lose a human life, one that is close to you and connected to you, you get your priorities fixed in order real quick and real thoroughly. So they say, what good is... Our lives are at stake. You can have this. Just get out. Don't kill us. We want to stay alive. And so they were only too willing and eager to accommodate this nation on the move to settle into their country's request for the gold to start and sustain a nation, and the silver and everything else and garments. And Yahweh gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, so that they gave them what they asked, and they plundered the Egyptians. So because Yahweh had providentially intervened to stir the hearts, he had also, we read that he had made Pharaoh hard-hearted. That does not eliminate their agency, but he had providentially conspired to place a man whose free will would be hard-hearted as him in the Exodus escape story to supplement the miraculous nature of it all. But here he also inclines the hearts of the people, the average denizens of the nation, to show grace and favor to the recently liberated slaves. And they're going to give them whatever they ask, and they plundered them. So they did not kill, they did not rape, they did not pillage, they simply plundered them. They did not leave their country empty-handed. And the children of Israel departed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides the little one. Now this location, Ramses was the name of Ramses II. He is perhaps the greatest New Kingdom pharaoh as military might. He was 19th dynasty. There was also Ramses III, who repelled the Philistines, the Aegean pirates, among other things. He repelled the Philistine Aegean pirates who had tried to set up shop in his land. He repelled them to the north, and there they remained as a perpetual nuisance and presence for the early nation of Israel. But now this number about 600,000 men. The exact number is 603,550. We read of in a later, I think the 38th chapter somewhere in this book. But it's qualified that he's approximating the figure. So oftentimes we read numbers in Scripture and such, but as we'll eventually read, we're going to read the number 430, and there's an element of exactness. That is the number of years at which this departure occurred, so that's. But we'll get on that when we get on that. But it's besides little ones, so that means they had the manpower of 600,000 men. So they had about 2.5 million men total, and their men, women, and children. 600,000 fighting men ready at arms. There was no army in the ancient world that large, but it is reasonably inferred that because they were a nation on the move, not in a settled location, they had the luxury of having every able-bodied man as a warrior and a soldier. And a mixed multitude went up with them too, also flocks and herds, very much livestock. So they didn't go alone. They had animals. They had everything to settle in the land they were determined to settle in. They are a nation uprooting from the nation where they grew as a nation within a nation to become a nation in the land that they had been promised to their patriarch Abraham, and passed on to him through Jacob, and then Joseph, the providence had drawn Joseph to Egypt and the nation of Israel down there with him, and then there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and that's the one who enslaved them. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt, and had not been able to delay, nor had they prepared food for themselves. So this translates what we already read in the instructions of the protocol, the processes within the process, why it was not leavened, because of the haste and urgency and emergency and the exigency of the emergency. They did not have they did not have the luxury to chow down on doughy, more delicious bread, but they had prepared food for themselves. They were on the move. They had to keep themselves going, and the only way to do that was to have this bread that did not have the benefit of leavened. And the source of yeast, and the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. So their time that they spent in Egypt was exactly 430 years. Now this poses the most reliable way to determine this date is to work backwards as opposed from forwards. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign, this was 966 BM. We read that it had been 480 years since the Exodus. This was when the temple was finally being built. In Genesis 15, Abram, as he is known as, frankly foretold that your ancestors will spend 400 years in bondage, and that can be a round number, or another way of looking at it is that in 1876 BM, Joseph came down in the so they remained slaves until 1446, if we align it to the calendar on that. And I probably presented that not as clear, and I apologize for the confusion, but remember, this is an exact number, 430 years. That was the amount of time they were down there. It is to the day and to the T. Everything unfolds according to providence, and the timing of everything in this chapter is under his control. And it came to be at the end of 430 years, on that same day it came to be that all the divisions of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. So on the day that marked the end or the beginning of their 430th year there, that was the exact date, to the day, the final day of that year was in fact the day that they ceased being a nation within a nation and became a nation. They spent 40 more years before they settled and claimed and conquered the Promised Land, but they were a nation on the move, working their way up from one nation to the next. And it is a night to be observed unto Yahweh for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This night is unto Yahweh to be observed by all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So the memorial of this momentous event, this historically, nationally, foundationally significant event for them as a nation and people, as a newly liberated people claiming the Promised Land, they were to observe and memorialize this event, bringing them out of the land of Egypt. That is the Exodus itself. That is their departure from slavery unto liberty. And it is to be observed by all the children of Israel, every single one of them. No Jew is exempt from the maintenance of the observance of this ritual annually throughout all generations, and it has been celebrated ever since. So there is an unbroken historical link from every year since this event occurred in about 1446, if we interpret literally backwards from 1 Kings 6:1. Or 4:1, when the 4th year of Solomon. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the law of the Passover. No son of a stranger is to eat of it, but any servant a man has brought for silver, then when you have circumcised him, then let him eat of it." So even Jews and foreigners, they were subjected to the same submission to the same covenant, which was the act of circumcision. The Jews were circumcised on the 8th day. This was their purification rite as prescribed in Leviticus chapter 14, verse 3. Also in Genesis 17, we read that Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day, and Abraham was circumcised when he was 99. Ishmael was circumcised when he was 13. So it is possible to be circumcised when you're not a baby, but in order to partake or indulge or participate in this ceremony, in this observance, and to maintain this festival, you had to be circumcised, or else there was no way you could partake of it. A sojourner and a hired servant does not eat of it. It is eaten in one house. You are not to take any of the flesh outside the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. So the breaking of the bone, this alludes to and typologizes the Messiah when he was, as John's Gospel it takes pains to point out, when he hung on the cross, they did not break his bones. Breaking of the bones was something customary for crucifixion victims. Once they gave out, they would break their bones, and that would send them over the ledge unto death, because once they lacked that stability, their body would crush. But the crucifixion accomplished its effect in Yahshua. So that wasn't necessary, but neither were the bones of the broken of the lambs that they were, because the lamb was the item they were to break or to eat. All the congregation of Israel are to perform it. So every congregation, that is, there's a plurality, every congregation in Israel of Israel are to maintain, preserve, and uphold it and perform it. And when a stranger sojourns with you and shall perform the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and perform it. And he shall be as a native of the land, but let no circumcised eat of it. So ethnicity and national background and origin are not what's important for acceptance in the covenantal community. What will get you in, what will get you accepted, what will get you equal recognition is the circumcision. Every male had to be circumcised, whether Jew or foreign born or sojourner or stranger or anything else, if they wish to partake in the Passover. And several of the escaped, we read in an earlier verse that a mixed multitude, verse 38, that means people of Egyptian background, people who were living in Egyptians, not Hebrews. They had become convinced and converted by the sign of the testimony that their God was true, and they wanted to join their community. So there was foreigners almost from the very instance of this initiation of this observance and holiday and festival. There is one law for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you. So there's to be a democracy and equality, the same standard for the native and the same born for the foreigner. And the word law is translated as Torah, so that is more than just one law. It is the law, the all 613, if we interpret it to its literal extreme, of commandments. And all the children of Israel did as Yahweh commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. So we read that earlier in verse 28. This is the instant and community-wide obedience. They received the commandment, they performed what they heard, they did what they were bid to do, and it is recorded and noted as such. 51st and final verse. And it came to be on the same day that Yahweh brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, according to their divisions. So they left as an army, and at the front line in their general, the commanding general is Yahweh of hosts. That is his military name. So they left a nation, an army of a nation on the march and on the move, armed with treasures and weapons and cattle and everything that they needed in a settled land. They just needed to get to the promised land, and there would be some delays. And Pharaoh, being the hard-hearted man, he would relent on his resolve to let them go. He would summon his chariots to chase them down. They were on foot by the time they reached the Red Sea, and it is miraculously made passable for them. But then the Red Sea reverts by the time the chariots try and go through it. But that's a story for a different time. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. See you then. Bye-bye.